Facebook. Recording has begun. Okay. Welcome everyone to History Matters and So Does Coffee. Today we are talking about democracy, but not just in and of itself. We're talking about what you lose when you lose democracy. And there were two things that sparked that. But before I get into that, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. I'm happy to be with you guys as we are every Friday. The way this is going to work is Joanne's going to talk about today's topic for about 30 minutes. Feel free to make comments and share links and all that good stuff in the chat. But if you have a question about today's topic, please put that in the Q&A. I'll be back in about 30 minutes and then we will take your questions. See you in a little bit.
Excellent. And if you are here for the first time, please make sure that your comments are going to everyone and tell the History Matters community. I think this is our 204th straight episode I saw. And there's an amazing community here that has been meeting here every week for a very long time. So if you're here for the first time, let people know and you'll get a robust welcome from the History Matters community. Okay. As I said a moment ago, there were two things that sparked this topic for today. One, and I suppose the initial one, was at CPAC going on right now. Apparently not a lot of people are at CPAC, but at any rate, and now I can't remember who stood up and said, yes, indeed, we're here to end democracy. We tried on January 6th, and, we'll do it next time. And just hearing someone say that like that, even if he was joking, very funny joke. So CPAC happens, there's this, moment when often sort of extreme people on the right get together and one of them gets on stage and says, yep, ending democracy. It reminded me of people who say horrible things. And then when you call them on it, they say, oh, it was just a joke. That did not amuse me. That alarmed me. And I said so somewhere on social media. But what that reminded me of, and what I talked about when I advertised this particular History Matters episode, it reminded me that 2 years ago, I did what you should never do. And I woke up in the morning, and for some reason, and I don't know why, I sent out a tweet. Tweeting like right before you go to sleep or right when you wake up, probably not good. So 2 years ago, and the tweet said, I don't think people realize what you lose when you lose democracy. And that's what I was thinking. I woke up, as one does in current times, and I thought, yep, how's democracy doing today? And then I just thought, I really fundamentally, I don't think people know what democracy is. I don't think they understand what it gives them, and I don't think they understand what goes away when it goes away. And since then, I've been talking about that in one way or another all over the place. At the time, what stunned me about that, so that's a pretty basic comment. I don't think people realize what you lose when you lose democracy. I think as of now, roughly 3 million people have seen that tweet. I believe it ended up with like 36,000 likes. And what was fascinating about that was that there were three kinds of responses. One group of people said what you would think people would say, which is, I think you're right. People don't realize what you lose when you lose democracy. But then there were two other groups. One group said, maybe it's time for something different, right? Maybe democracy doesn't work. Let's try something else. And one group said, we've never had it anyway, so who cares? Okay, so that said to me, these people don't know what democracy is. And fundamentally, it proved my tweet true, right? They don't know what you lose when you lose democracy. So given what was happening at CPAC, given that it reminded me of this tweet, given we are where we are, and that probably we're going to be talking about democracy any number of times over the course of the coming months, today seemed like a good day to just fundamentally address the basic issue. What does it mean when you lose democracy? And, in some ways, I think it was probably, so this was 2 years ago, I guess. was probably 2020 that we began to learn that some people really either didn't understand what democracy is or fundamentally didn't care what democracy is, because I think we've been learning gradually over the last few years that democracy takes work, that it's fallible, that the United States can lose it, and that people don't realize how hard it would be to get it back once it goes away. I think in some ways we've been exposed to lessons about democracy. Whether or not we've been heeding them, I don't know. But fundamentally, I think people haven't thought about the way in which democracy is about dividing and distributing power. Democracy gives the people, the demos, democracy, the right to delegate power, to, in one way or another, govern themselves through representation, and to hold the people they give power to accountable for how they use that power. That's pretty fundamental. And I'm going to come back in a moment to some of the other things that I think should get folded into how we understand democracy. I do want to make the important point that I suppose addresses the "we've never had it anyway" comment response to my initial tweet. It has to be said, right? The goal, the founders' blob goal, right? And I always say there's no founders' blob, but the general goal of the framers of the Constitution and the founders beginning the government was not democracy as they understood it. They thought democracy meant literally like government by the all. They thought that that meant chaos in some way. So they were not necessarily in favor of what we now understand to be democracy, partly for that reason, chaos, partly because they didn't necessarily trust the demos necessarily a lot. And if they did, it's a pretty select aspect, like a little population of, elite white men in the demos that they trusted and thought should have a part in government. So, you look back, and I've talked about this. I didn't go back and look at among the 203 previous episodes to see. I know I've talked about this before, where you have people like Hamilton saying, the number one problem in the United States right now is democracy. You have Jefferson saying, democracy can be a problem because the people aren't necessarily wise in their initial impulses about things. So democracy in and of itself has different meanings at different points in time, wasn't in and of itself the goal of the people who created the nation. And we've never had perfect democracy, far from it, right? And those of us who study or teach history, we definitely know that. Never been perfect, process in motion. We're on the road of democracy right now, and we don't know where we're going. Contingency, if people are playing bingo here with, for those of you who are here and haven't been here before, and I have no idea if bingo's going today, but sometimes people play bingo because I predictably say things like contingency. We don't know where we're going, and particularly regarding democracy, we don't know where we're going, but democracy has different meanings over time, has never been perfect, is not perfect, has always had flaws. But all of that said, generally speaking, here's what you can think about when you think about democracy. One aspect is really obvious: free and fair elections, right? Free and fair elections where someone wins and someone loses. And the people who lose, if they have questions, they use the systems in place to address those questions, and then they acknowledge that they lost, right? In a democracy, free and fair elections where there are outcomes that are acknowledged once the systems in place have addressed whatever concerns people have. Free and fair elections, the rule of law, that you believe that there are laws in place that you can refer to, that there's a court system that you can turn to help you with the enforcement of those laws. Again, nothing that I'm talking about here, I'm not saying it's perfect. By far, it isn't. But the fundamental idea of these things is fundamental in a democratic form of government. Popular representation, that you give power to representatives who are supposed to govern on your behalf in one way or another. Tied to that, and something that I talk about very often, accountability, that the people we give power to are accountable to us for how they use that power. And if we don't like how they use it, we, particularly if it's an elected office, if they're our representatives, then we vote them out. Or if they're corrupt, then we turn to legal systems to address the problem. But in one way or another, the people we give power to are accountable to us for how they use that power. That's at the absolute core of what democracy is. And of course, there are other things that are vital to democracy. You know, the right to protest against the government, the right of petition, which sounds quaint, but fundamentally what that means is the right to request, to demand what you want from the government, the right to address the government in that way, not necessarily with a petition, but that exchange of give and take, that matters. A respect for certain fundamental rights of citizens, again, definitely not something that is in perfect form right now, but the fact that we should, and many of us do, recognize that that right matters, that matters. So all of those things, I think, are inherent in a functioning democracy. But I want to make a point here, and it's one that I'm going to come back to again and again in my comments this morning. Obviously, everything that I've said there, democracy is a form of government. The United States is a democratic republic. Some would say a constitutional republic, but the Constitution creates a democratic form of government. So I would say we're a democratic republic. And a democracy is a form of government. But I would argue, and this is some of what I'm going to talk about today when I discuss what you lose when you lose democracy, democracy is also a frame of mind. Having a democratic government means you have certain rights, you have certain safeties, and whether you think about them or not, you assume that they are there, and that assumption really matters. That's part of what I want to talk about this morning. And I want to start out by offering you a metaphor, and it's been several years, maybe 2016, that I've had this metaphor in my head while I watch the ebbing and flowing of our politics and good moments and many, many bad moments. Somehow or other, the metaphor that I use for myself when I think about where we are at any given moment is the shutting of a door. So as long as the door is open, and again, this is my own personal way of envisioning this, I have no idea if this will be useful to you, but what I think of is when the door is open, democracy exists, and we have certain rights, and we have certain safeties. But over time, in recent years, that door seems to shut a little more, a little more, a little more. Once it shuts, we're in deep trouble. But in my mind, somehow, that's how I think about our current political situation and the fate, the nature, the condition of democracy. The reason why I think, particularly given that I thought about it to talk about this morning, I certainly have never expressed that, I don't think. But what's useful about that as a metaphor is it highlights an important point, which is you don't lose democracy like a light being shut out. You lose it bit by bit. You lose it step by step. You lose it like a door slowly moving towards being closed. And that's important. So that's some of what I want to address today. So an example of one of these things that you begin to lose and you don't realize you're losing it, but then once you do, door closing little. I think an early moment where I thought about in my own personal life, the creaking of the door was many years ago. I did something on TV. I don't even remember where. It might have been something for the BBC. And it was about what the importance of the words that a president offers versus other words. And what I got on and argued, not surprisingly, is when a president says something, it has added power, impact, and meaning, right? That's hardly shocking. But I was speaking against someone from the Trump administration who did not believe that and said so. Words are words, right? So I agreed to do this. Obviously, it's something I feel rather strongly about. Words matter. I've said so all over the place in any number of different forms of media over the years. I did that. This Trump administration person was not thrilled, but again, it happened. I left. And as I was walking from the studio to the subway, the thought crossed my mind, should I have done that? Like, is there some danger in my putting myself up against a member of the Trump administration and saying that what a president says matters and what this president just said matters and it's bad? And the fact that for a moment I stood on the street in New York and thought, am I in danger? That there was like a dark cloud came down over my head. And I didn't know what to do with the weight of it because I hadn't thought that way before, ever. And I suddenly felt the door click, a little bit closer to being closed because suddenly I was worried about my safety for simply criticizing, not even in a shocking, radical way, the simple fact that this president said some things that were bad. And whether I should or shouldn't have been worried, the fact that I was, that's important. And that's part of what I'm talking about here when I'm talking about democracy as a form of government. And it's also a frame of mind. It's also a mindset. It's also a spirit. So let's address, what do you lose when you lose democracy? Okay, one thing, really obvious thing that you lose is your right to shape government and its outcomes, right? If democracy is fading, you can no longer assume that certain rights or things that you think are either yours as a citizen or yours in a locality, in a town, in a county, in a state. You can't necessarily assume that those things are rights and that you can demand them, because you can't assume that you can put people in office and remove them when they don't do what you want them to do. This is fundamental. And again, I don't think people think about the fact that if democracy is ebbing away, we lose the power to shape what's happening. And sometimes when people, in response to, my saying over and over and over again over the years, we need to protect democracy, people will sometimes say, yeah, but we need to do this first. And logically, and I understand why they say it, climate should be first. Climate should be first. Well, here's my problem with that. I totally agree that we need to address the climate. If we lose democracy, we can't make people address the climate. We can't make people with power do anything. They will do what they want. So democracy is fundamental to our power as we, the people. And if we lose it, we can't address all these other things logically enough because we've surrendered the power of the demos. We've surrendered that fundamental power. What do we lose when we lose democracy? We lose belief in the rule of law. Now, again, things are flawed. I'm not saying that right now we have perfect and ideal rule of law in place. However, generally speaking, we do believe that there's a legal system in place. There's a judicial system. There are courts that at least most of the time they work. And if there's a problem, you can take it to court. There's a system in place where you can demand your rights. Maybe that will be served in the way you want, maybe it won't, but the existence of that system and the fact that on some certain level you can believe that there's a way for you to have rights, demand the rights, and address not having those rights met, you lose the rule of law, you lose that basic assumption. You also lose just the general belief that there are ways for you to get justice, right? That's pretty fundamental. Something pretty horrible happens if you really fundamentally don't have the power over the people we've given power to. Something horrible happens, and then what? Are you going to be allowed to protest if you're upset? Not necessarily. If you really lose democracy, then people who are in power and want to just hold power, they're not going to be thrilled about protest. I mean, it's such a fundamental level of existence, of rights, of demands that you lose when you lose democracy. It's not an ethereal idea, you know, and when I first said on social media, let's talk about what you lose when you lose democracy, and it got like a lukewarm response. And I thought, well, probably because people think this is some ethereal conversation. And it isn't. It really isn't. So I rewrote what I said and did it in a different way, and then I think people better understood what I was talking about. Okay, so what else do you lose when you lose democracy? You lose the simple belief that government exists to serve the people. Public servant, right? Government exists for us on a fundamental level. If you lose democracy, that is no longer necessarily true. And you lose the fundamental systems in place that can help you make those demands. I've said this many times before when I've talked about the creation of the Constitution. One of the fundamental things that the framers believed they were doing when they created the Constitution, so yes, they're creating a system of government, yes, they're creating a structure of government, but they also believed that they were setting in place a system, methods, a process, so that when things happened in future, there would be a system, a process in place that you could turn to address whatever's going on. The process, that's why James Madison took these amazing notes recording the process step by step of creating the Constitution. The process that was happening to create it mattered, and the process that it put in place, the Constitution, mattered. Democracy is that process. And if we don't have that process, if we can't rely on it to exercise our rights, to make demands, even if they're not valid demands, we should have the right to make them, right? Using systems of government. Those things, those fundamental things vanish if functional democracy goes away. Now, I'm saying, and this is what I mean when I say that democracy is a frame of mind or a spirit. It's structures of government, it's process, it's all of these things that I've talked about. But it's also a fundamental belief that you have the right as a citizen to expect certain things, to say certain things, to protest against certain things, to expect things of your government, to use the courts and other systems in place to make demands, to address wrongs. Those are fundamental assumptions, but they're a frame of mind. The fact that I left that studio and thought, am I in danger? That represents the slippage of democracy. I shouldn't be afraid to go on TV and say, former President Donald Trump said some bad words and they matter and they're not going to do us any good. And I was afraid. If you think about the climate that we're in now, and in any number of ways, I'm sure many of us are having this experience, and I have it sometimes online. You say something, you want to say something, and before you say it, you think, is this safe? And for those of us who are teachers, can I say this? Should I say this? Will my institution support me if I say this? Even though it doesn't seem harmful, is it harmful? What happens if I say this? If you're thinking that way, creak, the door has closed a little bit. The spirit of democracy is part of the system of democracy. So I want to add, I see I'm running out of time. That in and of itself matters fundamentally. And many of us have not come to grips with the degree to which we are already, doors not closed for sure, but sure as heck ain't fully open at this point. And I began to look up studies that, talking about how when you're measuring the status of democracy around the world, that the United States keeps slipping lower on that list. I meant to sort of check into that and didn't have time, but that is actually a fact. the larger point here is that when you lose democracy, you are at the whim of a government without accountability. People don't realize the degree to which they won't have power. They will lose fundamental rights to protest, to change things. Their lives will be shaped by the whims and hungers of those with power without the reliable rule of law for rescue. That's major, right? That's major. And I will say, if one party is denying validated electoral results, is physically intimidating voters, is pledging to never lose another election in the future, then democracy is on the ballot, and that party is against it. So it isn't hair on fire screaming when people say democracy is on the ballot. It is. And that matters. It matters, not just in an ethereal way, but because of the fundamental things that you lose and that you may not be able to get back, certainly not within our lifetime. And they're not ethereal, and they're not, sort of abstract, fundamental. A silly example, the roads in your area are bad, really bad, and you need them to get addressed. You need it to get fixed. So you go to local government of some kind, and you try and see what you can do to get people to notice, to fix the roads. Now, nothing might happen, and often nothing happens. But you assume there's a system in place. You assume their job is to address the roads, that you, as a citizen who lives in this place, deserve good roads, and that there's a system that should help with that. That's, again, really fundamental, not necessarily there in a government that is not fundamentally democratic. Now, I want to make one last point here. For those of us who are teachers, all of the things that I just talked about are part of why people who want power, particularly authoritarian power, it's why they attack teaching and learning. So when we're teaching, particularly history, we're teaching, among other things, about how people have had to fight for democracy. We're teaching about how people have fought for democracy. We're teaching about how people have attacked it and handicapped democracy. We talk about the opposition to democracy. We talk about the sacrifices that people have made to gain and preserve democracy. We talk about the failures in our democratic system. We expose them so that we understand how we've gotten to where we are and can better understand how to get to a better place. If you want power, if you are making a power grab, you do not want people to understand those things. You do not want people to understand that people have fought for rights, that we deserve these rights, that we should be able to protest and protect these rights, that they're fundamental. You don't want people to have context. You don't want people to understand struggle. You don't want people to understand rights. You want people to be happy where they are, or unhappy where they are, and with no awareness of what they can do to express that. So I'll close by saying, don't forget the door. Don't let the door close. Be aware of the fact that we're watching people push against that door, open, close, and it's in flux. It's really in flux. And this year, that's going to be the story of the next however many months until November and beyond, but particularly until November. Don't assume that democracy is an on or off thing and that it is here or it's not, and that, okay, some of it breaks down, but everything will be all right. The spirit of democracy matters, and that's something that can be taken away from you drop by drop. Okay, that is what I have to say for this morning. Thank you, Kara Lee. Mug. Okay, I'm closing my notes. Losing my notes so that I can get the mug. and open this so that I can see everybody. I obviously feel really passionately about this, beyond passionately about this. Okay. This is obvious, the mug that I have chosen. Thank you for engaging in democracy every Friday morning. I know I say it every week. This is the most obvious mug in the world. But sitting here and objecting and protesting and asking, querying, thinking about demands, trying to understand how we got here, trying to understand where we might be able to go, doing it as a group, that's democracy, man. And that's what we've been doing for 204 weeks. Okay.
204 weeks.
I know that's bonkers. But
I
yes.
know, actually, those numbers are staggering. Wow. So the chat has been on fire, as you can imagine.
I was blocking it out because I was trying desperately to like focus on the topic, but I can imagine it must be on fire.
We got quite a few new folks, which is exciting.
Which is wonderful.
Yeah. And okay, so we're going to dig right in because we've got tons of great questions as well. And our buddy Clinton, who is riding the back of a vehicle, apparently. So we've got trains and cars and all these people tuning in from various moving vehicles, but he's not driving, we made sure. Clinton asks, any thoughts about the difference between a developing democracy and a democracy in decline?
Oh, interesting. Well, I guess I would say, and I thought about this in regard to the United States, because I think it is or has been, certainly in the past, tempting to think about us as, until the recent past, a sophisticated elderly democracy, right? Like, oh yes, we're good at this. And that some of what I did in my most recent book was to say, yeah, well, let's go to 1850. Like, you can't say that there are like primitive democracies and then sophisticated democracies, and that somehow we're the sophisticated one. Like, we've been pretty primitive at times too, and right now we're sort of have some primitive slippage, I would say. So developing democracy, if there's a government that is finding its way step by step into being more democratic, that's a process you can see, right? That's something that you can judge. I guess you can go back to my door. That isn't necessarily the same thing as a country where democracy is in slippage. And I think it just has to do with a starting point, right? So the United States is a country where democracy is in slippage. Whether or not we've met them, we have certain ideals and structures in place about what's supposed to be and rights we're supposed to have. And if they're not being met and if they're being eroded, slippage. The force, the energy is on the other side of the tracks if you're looking at countries that are moving towards something more democratic. So although I guess I would say the uniting factor there is democracy in flux, right? And I've said again and again and again, democracy is a process. It doesn't end. And so a common theme between developing democracy, slipping democracy, is the flux, is the fact that it's in flux. And I suppose I would argue in one way or another, democracies are always in flux because they're always vulnerable. And particularly now, we can never take democracy for granted again. We shouldn't have, but we shouldn't now.
But probably 10 years ago, we never imagined we'd be in this spot.
Well, so that's the thing, right? That I don't know how many years ago this would be. And we can sit here and talk, historically speaking, well, there was the 1980s and there were the Republicans and we could talk about the history of how we got here, and that makes perfect sense. But on a fundamental level, I did not think that in my lifetime we would be at this kind of moment, this kind of door shutting moment. I don't think I ever thought that what we had was infallible. I think actually that as Jewish American, just as a Jewish person, I don't believe any systems are infallible. I believe that the most structured, grounded systems of government can be warped. So that is something I've always and obviously continue to believe. But in an immediate way, in the way that we live now, I didn't imagine that. And I think, you know, as an American, I always talk about my different brains, my citizen brain, my historian brain, my American brain. I guess I could say there's like a Jewish brain too. I think that while part of me has always had like a higher level of alarm about like, where's the government? What's the government doing now? I think right now, all of those brains, all of those brains agree about what I just talked about, which is not just structures, not just evolution, but an actual threatening process.
Yeah. But then, you know, I also 4 years ago, if you had told me all the monuments in Richmond were going to come down, I wouldn't have believed that either.
There's so many things.
So it's like,
so many things, right? There's so many things, and not all of them are bad, right? Now it's not as though because we could all sit here and name things that we've seen in the last 10, 15 years that we never imagined we would see. There are lots of them, but there are some things you could say, okay, well, that was positive change, right? It's not all negative change, but
your thoughts on that?
Well, and
Very polarizing.
we're in a moment of extreme contingency. That's obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Okay. Our good longtime friend Kathy Porter asked, we're seeing many instances of stifling of democratic norms in Florida here in particular. This is especially seen with teaching and history. She's looking for advice on how to fight this. And a lot of people are referencing the comic, the Doonesbury comic this past week. That was in the chat a lot.
Right. Although, so I actually want to say something about that. And I tried to investigate it and I don't have the answer. So I did see, and for those of you that don't know, there's a Doonesbury comic that was particularly mocking what's going on in Florida, that there's a teacher teaching that the Civil War, the panels are of a teacher in a classroom in Florida teaching that slavery caused the Civil War. And the students are basically, you know, one of them says, should we rat on her? And another one says, how do you feel safe teaching about this? And she says, you know, well, my husband's in a car outside. And a student says, tell us when you cross the state border, right? So first of all, that cartoon, when Doonesbury goes on education, because I remember other cartoons over the years, it goes good. In this case, that cartoon didn't appear in Gannett newspapers. And apparently, and I didn't know this, every Sunday, Doonesbury does a new, obviously that one's new comic. And what was reported, and what I actually said on social media, I think on Threads, was that was cut from Gannett. It was cut from Gannett newspapers. What the heck does that mean, right? It's on a fundamental level that's suspicious. Now, then I read that it had already been decided, like Gannett has decided that there are 23 comic strips that will be within its newspapers, and that this one was cut a long time ago and it had been announced and this was nothing new. And then I went to find a credible news source that would tell me about this, which I have not yet found, but I didn't have a lot of time. Anyway, I say this because I said on social media, censorship, and it very well might be, but I don't know yet. And I couldn't find, you know, anything other than cartoon blogs, anyone to tell me what the real story was here, or even what the story was behind Gannett deciding only 23 comic strips are going to be allowed in Gannett newspaper. So anyway, I just wanted to say that to set the record straight. But right, that cartoon in and of itself, like, you know, it makes you laugh and cry at the same time. How to fight that? You know, I suppose in part, I would say, and this is obvious and it's not an answer. And I know that there are people who are getting parents involved in a way that is supporting bans and censoring of certain topics. But there are parents who can come forward and do the precise opposite with power in groups. The most powerful force of change in American history is people organizing on the ground level and pushing up. Fundamentally, it's not top-down change that really changes things. It's bottom up. It's people organizing to do things together. the demos, right? People creating a we, some kind of a we, and then working together to demand change. Now, sometimes people doing that are not demanding changes that appear, at least to me, to be particularly healthy. But you have the right to do that too, right? You do. And it matters in the same way that it might be or seem ridiculous for me to say every Friday, like, what we do here matters. It's like, yeah, there's 150 of us that meet here and talk, and then I don't know how many, 1,000, however many of us see this over time. Like, big deal. It's a small number, but it does matter. It's the small groups that matter. You can repeat them, you can make them, you can come together and you can act. So that's not a solution. That's not an answer, but maybe consider it a reminder.
Yeah. I'm going to combine Dave and Kevin's question because they are similar. They're both concerned about the fact that we have judges that now need 24/7 protection, teachers almost need 24, and they're wondering, should there be a growing concern for the safety of anybody who's trying to advocate for preserving and saving democracy? And do you think they're asking, is Navalny's murder a wake-up call? But what is the best way to maybe wake up all of our neighbors to make them understand this is happening and we need to do something about it?
Yeah. So should we be concerned? Yeah. If you are afraid to be a polling place worker, if you're afraid to be a teacher, or you're afraid as a teacher about what precisely you can and can't say, and you're afraid not because you absolutely know a bad thing will happen, but because you think it might. And you're doing that internal game that I talked about with the BBC. Do I say this? Do I not say this? Is it safe to say this? What happens if I say this? Should I just not say it at all? If you're thinking about silencing yourself, you're already watching this happen, right? So that in and of itself is an alarm bell. It shouldn't be there, right? That's a fundamental right, fundamental rights of of speech. You could say education, throw that in the mix. Those are fundamental rights being violated, and being violated in a way, and this is along the lines of what I wrote about in my book and I've talked about before, right? In my book, I talk about how Southern slaveholders intimidated Northerners, discouraged them from standing up and saying anything about slavery, not because they were always violent, but because they could be violent. What mattered was the threat, was the intimidation factor. So I found a lot of violence, enough violence on the floor of the House and Senate that Northerners truly believed that they could be physically accosted, that they could be assaulted for standing up and saying something about slavery. Once people believe that's possible, once a polling worker or someone who wants to work at polls thinks, like, I don't know, even more fundamentally, once people begin to wonder if it's safe to vote, right? Safe to register to vote, safe to teach in a classroom. That gets into the spirit of democracy and what you lose when you lose democracy. Because if you're not sure if it's safe to vote, and we've had moments in American history when that has been true before, if you're there, you're talking about people, for them, fundamental rights of democracy don't exist. Now, Jim Crow, that was true for Black Americans in a variety of different ways. Right now, in a sense, it's true for a much broader range of us. Maybe that in and of itself is eye-opening. Maybe people who kind of who looked away or didn't pause to think about rights being taken away by specific groups. Maybe now that it's broader, threatened to a broader population, maybe now that'll open their eyes. Maybe the assassination of Navalny will open people's eyes to that danger. I don't know, but I think we shouldn't just think, should I go to a polling place? We should think along the lines of that question. What does it mean if I'm afraid to work at a polling place? Like, what does that mean? And can I come together with other people to address what that means, to be loud about it, to speak up about it, to talk to people who still are your representatives about it, particularly on a local level? Again, I feel, I always want to have like the bing, here's a solution, which I don't have. But parts of the solution are bound up with being loud and pointing things out and addressing them and getting others to address them, exposing things, right? Pointing to them, particularly, a whole different issue we don't have to talk about today, but when the press doesn't cover something major, like the charges used to try to impeach President Biden appear to have been planted by Russians, and that somehow has not become a major news story. That's a moment when you got to speak up. That's a moment when you have to say, this is major. I'm not going to shut up, because if I shut up, it's going to get memory hold. I'm going to speak up. I'm going to keep speaking up. I'm going to get other people to speak up. I'm not going to stop. I'm going to call people. I'm going to do what I can do so that that thing remains in the public mind. Again, not a solution, but better than holding back. And at least, given that we still have democracy and that the public voice and public opinion matters and that political power still rests with us, what we say and what we do matters.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to combine Tim and Margaret's questions. Tim's worried that people are kind of getting democracy is in peril fatigue, and we still have a long way to go between now and November. And Margaret's worried and wondering, I think everybody in the chat is worried about that, but Margaret's wondering, did the founders how did they prepare themselves for risk like this? Or were they ever in a similar, situation where they were worried about democracy early on? And maybe could we glean something from lessons from them?
Well, the first question about, people getting, democracy is in danger, burned out, I think that's really valid. And I think about that a lot, right? So sometimes I think about, is this safe to say? And normally I say it anyway, but the fact that I have to think about it is alarming. Sometimes I think about, is my tone here right? Because if I start screaming too early, people aren't going to hear me when I'm screaming, in 4 months or something. I think that's valid. And I think it's totally possible that we're going to be at a point where people just don't hear it. So, in general, my approach has been to talk about this in a pointed way, in a blunt way, but not yet in a hair on fire way. I think by the time you get to hair on fire, you do that for too long. And, what is it? Is it Chicken Little? The sky is falling, the sky is falling. I can't remember which it is, right? It's like, and after a while, no one pays attention to you. And then, isn't there a wolf? Is it the wolf? There's a wolf fable too, whatever it is.
I think it's more the Chicken Little.
No, there's The Boy Who Cried Wolf.
Oh, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Yeah.
Same idea, that if you howl for a while, then people aren't going to hear you. And I think that's valid. And I think very much, I've talked, actually, Heather and I, on one of the episodes of our podcast, talked about this with Carol Anderson, about how carefully we regulate the tone of what we say so that people will still hear us and not tune out the democracy is threatened message. And that's hard. And I don't have a solution for that. And I think about that all the time. And I'm going to still work at that. I think it's a risk. I also think it's real. And so somehow or other, we have to find a way. And maybe, wouldn't it be nice if there were people in the press who were in a very factual way saying, so this is what one candidate wants to do, and this is what the other candidate wants to do, and how do we measure democracy with those things, right? It would be useful to, in some way or another, have calm discussion about what is or isn't democratic, and what, when people are making suggestions about what they want to do when they have power, what aspects of that clearly aren't democratic, because some things clearly aren't. Right? Some things, it's not a matter of opinion, right? Some things are just clearly not democratic. And by saying that, you're not taking a side, you're stating a fact. Whole different conversation about the press and what it should do. And we've already started that conversation. I know we'll have it again, but that's part of the answer to this. But that was the first part. What was the second question?
The second part was, were the founders ever in a similar spot where they were fearful for democracy, and could we maybe learn something from how they handled it?
Well, so the fundamental thing that the founders worried about when it came to democracy was demagogues. Right, exactly. So, you know, you read their letters, you read their writings, you read their pamphlets. That was the fear. They looked at republics over time and, you know, sort of democratic-ish modes of government over time, but particularly republics versus monarchies. And what they saw was that the main threat to a republic is a demagogue, because if a republic is grounded on the demos, right, if it's grounded on the public opinion, anyone who can pander to the public and appeal to them and get them to like him or her and then get power, and that's not hard to do. Once they have power, they can do whatever they want, and thus republics die. So demagogue, you know, if you went, you can try this experiment. Go to Founders Online, which is the National Archives' version of like Jefferson Papers, Washington Papers, Hamilton Papers, and just search on the word demagogue or demagogical, but demagogue, and just see what comes up. They talked about this a lot. So that was how they addressed this. They said democracy is vulnerable because of demagogues. And that's why, so I've talked before, there was this quote I found buried in the middle of a Hamilton letter to Washington. Thomas Jefferson made a list of, like, you know, went to Washington and said, here are the top 20 reasons why I don't trust Hamilton. And Washington rewrote it and said, some friends of mine in Virginia have these reasons why they don't trust you, address them. And Hamilton did in this very long report. And in the middle of it, he says, you know who really is a threat to democracy? Not me. It's people who find a way to pander to the public, get in power, create chaos, and then ride the whirlwind of chaos into seizing power and then doing whatever the heck they want. And he adds to that, right? Often these people have like military experience, and that's helpful. It's you know, he was talking, and I actually was posting about this online. He's talking about Burr in a variety of different ways. But what's interesting about that quote, way back, I posted that online. It's not a quote people know because it's buried in the middle of a report. And since then, it is like the viral quote. And Judge Ludwig, in the last week or two, posted it again. I was like, the quote's back, the quote's back. Because, you know, what it says is so fundamental to the now. Demagogues are the threat because they take advantage of us, and they seize public sentiment. They appeal to emotion. They get people's emotions riled up. People travel along for the ride, and once this person has power, it is all over. That's the fear. So that definitely is something we should understand and learn from. And the reason why my magical quote appears and appears and appears is because it is a fact that demagogues are a threat to democratic forms of government. Period. It's not just the founders. It's not just like, Athens. It's a fact. The founders thought about it because they were experimenting with a new form of government in their world, but it is true. And we're watching it, right? We're watching it. If you are a historian of early America or the founders, you have this like encyclopedia of quotes, just like, in your head, different people saying, demagogue, pass to people, like, this is bad, this is, you know, it's a really interesting moment to be a historian, and to be a historian of the founding period when they were wrestling with democracy and what it meant and how much of it the United States should have.
Yeah. Somebody had put it in the chat that another mug was, no man in the country is so high that he's above the law. And that goes along with Bobbynid. Is it Nids? Bobby, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your last name right, but I know you've been with us, but I apologize if I did not pronounce that correctly. Bobby is worried and wondering if the former president is not punished for January 6th insurrection, then is that it for democracy? Because the system has to work for everyone, right? So if that does not occur, she's wondering, is that the end? Will that just, we won't survive it, do you think?
Well, I have said a version of that. My preaching about accountability, and I said many times, as a country, we're experiencing a crisis of accountability. People in power somehow don't feel accountable. People feel that they should be able to say or do anything, whatever they want. They have the right to say or do whatever they want, and they're not accountable for it somehow. That they can commit crimes and they're not accountable for them somehow. So speaking generally, if people feel that they can commit crimes, and particularly people with power, like presidents, feel that they can commit crimes and nothing happens to them, that's basically an assault on the rule of law. And that is a slap in the face assault on the idea that we all, as a people, are joined together under a system of law. Now, again, every time I make a pronouncement about democracy and rule of law, the first thing that leaps to mind is all of the ways in which our system of law is flawed, right? All of the ways, critical race theory, right? All of the ways in which fundamentally, systematically, there are ways in which our system is flawed and is biased, and that's a fact, whether you're allowed to say critical race theory or not, right? That's a fact. Not taught in elementary schools, law schools. Pardon?
Not in Florida.
Not in Florida. But anyway, the fact of the matter is, all of these things are flawed. And now I've totally lost my way where I was going with that. Where was I headed?
About if the people from January 6th, including
right,
the highest ranking person, which was the former president, if people don't see that person being punished and held accountable, is that it for democracy, was the question.
I can't say that's it for democracy. I could say that's a really bad sign. And it's part of why I argued when there was discussion about should there be hearings or not. I was howling yes. Why? Because a hearing represents a line being drawn. A hearing says a line was crossed and we're going to have a hearing about this. It's an acknowledgement that something wrong seems to have happened and that there is a line. So regardless of what happened with the hearings, I thought they were vitally important along this same reasoning, along the same line of logic. So, if people aren't held accountable, people in power as opposed to average people are not held accountable for what happened on January 6th. Yeah, that's a big problem. Will I say that it's the end of democracy? I don't know, because I can't make predictions of that sort, but it's not healthy for a democracy, and particularly not healthy when people who are not being held accountable are trying to get power. That's a big problem. They're assuming that they are not accountable for what they did.
Yeah.
And if they are not accountable and they feel that it doesn't matter, why would they not do it again? Right? Accountability is partly what stops people from just doing what they do, right? If you're not held accountable, why stop? If you commit crimes over and over and over again and no one holds you accountable, why are you going to stop committing crimes? Right?
Same with kids cheating. If they keep cheating and get away with it, they're going to keep cheating.
And
Why do the work?
Absolutely. And if you keep committing crimes or cheating and getting away with it, that's a power trip. Look at me, right? I'm violating laws. I'm doing all kinds of wrong things. No one holds me responsible. This makes my ego feel really good. Like we're watching a lot of that go on right now too. We're lying and cheating and committing crimes when you get away with them a lot. Makes you feel really good about yourself and makes other people, some of them at least, think there must be something great about you because you're getting away with all these things. So, clearly you must be a leader. This is warped thinking. But yeah.
So Daniel asks, we called populism as surging around the world as strongmen, charlatan strongmen, he calls them, try to subvert democracy to the benefit of oligarchs. Is there something fundamentally different about the way what's happening in the United States now from the rest of these movements through history? Are the modern day, what some people call MAGA nation or whatever you want to call this movement, Is it more extreme than the past, or is it sort of in line with all the other ones over history?
The modern day witch movement?
The MAGA movement, or what we're
Oh,
seeing, this,
MAGA.
you know, group
Is that
that's
like a new thing?
right. Well, have there been others more extreme, or is this like, are they as bad as it seems in the current moment? Because we didn't live through the other ones, right? So I think the point of Daniel's question is, it seems like the worst one ever, but is that true? Is it just throughout history
Oh,
there's been
I'm never gonna go with this, this is the first, the only, the worst. It's extreme. It's really extreme. And the thing that's distinctive about this moment is that it has a former president trying to be a president at the heart of it. It's one thing to say that there are movements that have been extreme, which there have been, that are dangerous, that are white supremacists, that are violent, right? This is all part of American history, that in some places, clearly they don't want you to be teaching, but it's there. But when a president is behind that, and the president essentially has taken over the apparatus and identity of a party, that's something distinctive. That's distinctive about this moment. That's a thing to watch, because that's not on this level to this degree something that we've had before. I want to address something that, because it went whizzing by. Gloria said, and I think it's in response to people being held accountable, I think. She said, you're presumed innocent until found guilty. And I don't want to like misstate it. And that's true. I'm not saying you have hearings to, and as a matter of fact, a hearing isn't a trial. It's a statement that, oh, a line was crossed and now we're going to have a hearing about it. And here's a lot of evidence. Okay. Definitely you're presumed innocent until found guilty, but that's part of what I talked about when I talked about the spirit of a democracy, right? You believe you have a right, and you do, to a trial. You believe that you have the right to be presumed innocent until found guilty. These are fundamental things that we rightly believe we deserve, and that's true. So, in the case of some people before us in the public eye, they've been found guilty of crimes. So I'm not like announcing that they're guilty without a trial that's proven it. But that I'm not saying attack, kill, crush, destroy, presumed innocent doesn't matter. Of course it matters. But there has to be accountability, meaning a trial, questions, the process in motion, not just letting things drift around. Accountability isn't guilt. Accountability is, you did this thing, let's discuss what it means. And if it's a crime, you will be held accountable. That's what.
And speaking of Gloria, Gloria had a quote in here, well, not a quote, but a restating. She said, John Adams said, a republic depends on virtue in the people. Virtue meaning acting for the public good over selfish desires. Have we lost the virtue necessary for democracy to flourish?
Well, virtue is another one of those words in the founding period, like democracy, that has its own meaning. It is very true that the founding generation, generally speaking, because a republic was grounded on public opinion, there was an assumption that that meant that the people, the demos, need to be educated and able to think for the common good. Not everyone thought that that was necessarily going to happen. Hamilton is a guy who very much believed that, like, no, people are selfish. Come on, be real. So what we do is we create strong government to channel passions, and that's how we create a good form of government. The reason why in this period, the founding period, there was so much attention being paid to education, even of women, right? Was this belief that people need to be educated and they need to understand right and wrong and virtue to be able to think for the common good. Now, that was a thought, that was an ideal, it's not as though that sort of beamed down from above. Have we lost that assumption about virtue, and tied to that, the fact that we can think of the common good? Well, some historians argue that when you go back to the founding period, what you see is that idea of small r republicanism never really existed, right? They thought it should be there. Like in Gordon Wood's book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, the middle section of that is on republicanism. And part of what it says is, they weren't clear on what it was. And it didn't last very long because this idea about we're all going to work for the public good didn't necessarily work the way that they thought it should. But, and I've talked about this a lot too, there should be a we. Now that could be a really divided, conflicted, angry we, but there should be a we that basically believes, yeah, okay, we got a constitution. Generally speaking, we share certain fundamental values. We come together as a people, assuming that those things are in play, and then we fight over everything else. And, you know, part of what has been surprising to me, and now we're going way over, we can go to the after party shortly. You know, one of the things that surprised me along this level about virtue and do we have what it requires and the we, was just watching a pandemic unfold and seeing people who are not willing to put a mask on. I don't want to wear a mask. You don't have a right to make me wear a mask. I'm not going to wear a mask. Really? Really? Like, put a piece of cloth on your face for a couple of months. You know, the fact that people were not, and that became like my right. First of all, we're not going to talk about the fact that somehow that right matters, but the fundamental right of women to have control over their bodies doesn't. But we won't talk about that right now. But still, the idea that, you know, I don't have to, that was the most fundamental slap in your face, lack of a we moment.
Yeah.
Like,
and the same people said, you can't make my kid wear a mask. And then they complained we had to shut the schools down because so many kids and teachers were sick. There was literally not enough people well enough to even show up at school to watch your child. So that you can't have it both ways. You can't refuse to wear a mask and then get mad when school has to shut down because everybody's sick.
The fundamental we as a nation is a fundamental one. There's a fundamental we of humanity that isn't about nationalism and nationhood. And even that right now is a little bit under attack, right? Like just understanding we share a common humanity. And the fact that some people clearly don't think that at this particular moment. I don't even know what to say about that. But yeah, we got some problems with we. And like I said, the pandemic was what exposed that in the bluntest way to me, but it's not the beginning of it, and we're still in the middle of it. Okay, I guess we need to stop. Although this is going strong.
A lot more questions.
I know. Do you want to, maybe guys, we can keep going a little bit?
There's one more. I just want to sneak Cece's in because she was actually the first one to enter it. I don't want her to feel like.
Yeah, no, let's keep going a little bit. Let's keep going a little bit.
Wondering with the reaction to Navalny's murder in the news, will we still be able to keep that, sustain that, you know, through to election time, or people just, you know, will it be a wake-up call, or will people just forget it the way they forget the mass shooting the day after the mass shooting, or they forget, you know, will they forget the NATO remarks by November? That was actually in a couple of different questions. But is it wishful thinking that maybe this, it's like every time that something horrible is said or done, we think surely now these people will wake up, and is that wishful thinking is what Cece's question.
Well, it's part of why I said be loud, right? Because what we see repeatedly is something really important. Like that's one thing, like the fact that, you know, the Hunter Biden charges were planted by Russians and are not true. That thing comes out, that's a major thing. You know, the New York Times put it on page A16. Things get memory hold, things get ignored. And if we don't speak up, if we don't keep pointing to them, then yeah, they just go away. It's clear, right? Our news cycles these days exist for approximately 20 minutes, right? There's like a 20-minute window when we notice things, and then, or maybe 24 hours, let's be generous, and then they're gone, right? And we can't let that happen. We can't just allow things to drift away like that. We have to keep talking about them. We have to keep pointing them out. We have to get other people to keep pointing them out. We have to not let them get memory hold. And it's easy to say that and hard to do that. But just with that story itself, you know, already not quite at the center of news, as it should be, right? And as a matter of fact, I think I read something where Jim Jordan is still saying, like, you know, well, yeah, we still got a case, like without facts. you know, and it's assuming that he can say that because people aren't going to stay on top of this and it's not getting a lot of press. That's a long way of making the point that I was making to answer Cece's question. But yeah, I think that's a problem, and I think it's a risk, and I think I don't know the solution to that, but part of a solution is to not let these things get memory hold, and to point out and talk and write and phone people. And there have been moments in recent years where people got really upset about something and screamed about it, and then there was a change. Even just recently, there was a and I can't prove the way change happened, but there was a New York Times headline that said, beleaguered Biden tries again with student loan. And people screamed. They were like, really? Beleaguered? He just tried. Like, why beleaguered? And then the headline was changed, right? And beleaguered was removed. Sometimes screaming actually has an impact, not always. But that doesn't mean we should stop. Pointing out, highlighting. It's part of why I repeat things again and again and again and again in public-minded things that I do, because we can't let them be forgotten. And if my voice is a little louder than some, okay, I'm going to use it to keep driving this home again and again and again.
Plus, we know in teaching, you have to repeat it at least 3 times before it sticks for the kids.
That's a good point.
We'll have to hear things more than once.
I also want to just highlight, Tom put something in chat a couple minutes ago. He said, innocent until proven guilty applies to criminal matters where a person's life or liberty is at stake. As citizens, we're under no moral obligation to withhold guilty judgments of public actors who clearly are corrupt. As citizens, we have a right to have opinions, but innocent until proven guilty legally is certainly fundamental. So anyway, I thought that was a good point and an important point to make. You guys are on fire. You're zipping along here so much that it's like, oh, that was several minutes ago. Miriam said, when America gets through this, I wonder when this period will be, how this period will be in the history books, and will there be a long, hard look at the institutions altogether? I think about this all the time, constantly. How is history going to look at this moment? And sometimes, fellow historians are like, "Why, you're optimistic that there are going to be historians." Like, yeah, well, okay, maybe I am. But this is a moment. This is a historic moment. It's a moment in which fundamental, big things in a pattern are happening with a major impact and evidence, right? So thinking like a historian, when I see what's happening and I see the pattern unfolding, because historians look for patterns and then seek meanings, you can't miss it. And sometimes something happens and I'll be like, yeah, okay, well, there's a dissertation. Like, wow. So if I, 50 years in the future, man, and I had a grad student, I would totally say, go look at this thing, because that's big. I don't know how this moment will be in history books, because it totally depends on who ends up on top and who ends up on bottom as far as what we think and teach and learn about American history. But the fact of the matter is, while there are all moments have their share of history happening within them, and there is a former episode, I don't remember the title, it was something like when you're living through history, I think, or something like that. So for those of you who are new here, all of our past episodes are archived and are available online. And I'll say it at the end, but I'll say it here. At the same place you went to come here, ncheteach.org/conversations. All the past episodes are archived there. You could look for this one when you're living through history. I know they're also on YouTube. But anyway, we've talked about this, and it will be in the history books. This gets us back to the topic of today. What do you lose when you lose democracy? Well, one thing you lose is, your ability to assume that there will be some people who are watching and reporting on what's actually happening and have the power and the right to do that. If you're censoring history, if you're eliminating things that can be taught that actually happened, you censor history, you censor the past, you shape the future.
And we might go down history today as our longest episode ever. It's 11:17.
I know, it is our longest.
Maybe that's 11.
Oh, there it is, Dale, on
It
living,
was important.
on living through history, and it was March 31st, 2023. So yeah, okay. So now some of you people are saying after party. So here's what I think. So here, for those of you who are new here, here's what normally would have happened 17 minutes ago. Normally we segue from our episode to the after party, and what that means is we stop recording. And so we can be even freer and easier and talk about whatever we want to talk about in the after party. This is an important discussion. And who knows what'll happen this week in which a different version of it, I'll feel like we should keep going next week. It's a really, really important conversation. But maybe we should at least have a little while in the after party, and then I know people have to flee. The camera, we will stop recording. If you are on Facebook and you want to be part of the after party, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations, ncheteach.org/conversations, and then poof, you will be part of the after party in ways stronger and more powerful than I normally say at the end of every episode. Thank you for engaging in democracy on a Friday morning, folks. I know that there's no poof. That was my poof.
They were afraid you weren't going to say it.
Oh, okay. Oh no,
I think people needed it for bingo.
Oh no, I was going to say, if you're playing bingo, then you assume I'm going to refer to Annie as my partner in crime. You assume I'm going to say contingency, and you assume I'm going to say poof.
Those are like our three canon words that
those are always going to happen in every episode. Anyway, I really do mean thank you all for being here and continuing to be here for all these weeks, all these years that we've been here. These conversations matter, and in a sense, there's no better example than today, and really getting into what democracy is and what it means if you don't have it. I know I'll want to talk about it again. Those of you who are here and who are new, I really, really hope that you will come back. This is an amazing community. For years, we've been coming here, we've been meeting here, and we have been addressing in one way or another politics and history. You know, and it's a great community. I don't know if you've gotten a sense of that in the chat, but it is. Yeah, close to 4 years, almost 4 years. So anyway, I hope that you will come back if you're coming here for the first time. As I said before, all of the past episodes are archived on ever so many topics. I don't know what we'll talk about next week, so I can't tell you that, but we will be here next Friday, 10 o'clock in the morning. Thank you, Annie and Jessica and Claire and John and you guys, the History Matters community, for being here and making this possible week after week after week. And I want to say, Kevin just said, thank you for giving us hope. I want to end with that, right? We are not hopeless. We should not be hopeless. We have hope. We should. We just have to work. We have to come together. We have to not be silent, not be paralyzed. We have to be whatever we can do to create a we. It could be a small we, could be a big we, but we should have hope because we can make change, because we are still a democratic form of government. Okay, now I'm going to shut up and we can go to the after party.